Ethan Carter stood behind the counter of the small diner, the scent of sizzling bacon and coffee permeating the air. The diner, nestled on a quiet street corner, catered to regulars who sought comfort in predictable meals. It was far from glamorous, and Ethan had long outgrown its confines, but it was where he had landed after culinary school, unable to find a foothold in the competitive world of fine dining. The walls, adorned with faded photos and retro signage, seemed to mirror his own stifled ambitions, worn, overlooked, and stagnant. Each day felt like a compromise. Ethan's talent and passion for cooking were evident in the care he put into every plate, even the simplest orders. Yet, the creativity he craved to express was stifled by the diner's limited menu and clientele who preferred tradition over innovation. The regulars, mostly construction workers and office employees from nearby, wanted hearty meals that were familiar, not experimental. Whenever Ethan attempted to slip in a touch of originality, perhaps a herb-infused omelet or a reimagined classic, it was met with polite indifference or outright rejection. The evenings were the hardest, as the diner emptied and Ethan found himself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up and reflecting on another day of unfulfilled potential. His culinary school diploma hung on the wall at home, a reminder of dreams that once seemed within reach. He'd entered school brimming with enthusiasm, determined to carve a unique path in the culinary world. His instructors had praised his innovative approach to flavors, and his classmates often marveled at his ability to transform ordinary ingredients into extraordinary dishes. But the real world had been less welcoming. Rejection after rejection from high-end restaurants had chipped away at Ethan's confidence. Most places dismissed him as too inexperienced, while others couldn't see past his modest background. The culinary world, he had learned, was not just about talent. It was about connections, luck, and timing. Ethan had none of those. What he did have was an ever-growing pile of bills, a dwindling savings account, and the lingering doubt that maybe his dreams were too big. As he wiped down the counter one evening, his thoughts drifted to the restaurant he had always envisioned. It wouldn't be extravagant, but it would be a place where people came to experience something truly special. Meals that told stories, evoked memories, and celebrated the art of cooking. He imagined an open kitchen where he could interact with diners, sharing his passion and watching their reactions to his creations. The thought brought a small smile to his face, but it was quickly replaced by a sigh. Dreams, he reminded himself, didn't pay the rent. Ethan's best friend, Mia, often stopped by the diner to keep him company during her breaks from her job at a nearby bookstore. She was his sounding board, the one person who believed in him even when he doubted himself. That evening, as she sipped her coffee and watched him close up, she tried to lift his spirits. "You're too talented to be stuck here," she said, her voice steady but filled with frustration. "You gotta keep pushing, Ethan. Someone out there will see what you're capable of." Ethan shrugged, his shoulders heavy with the weight of reality. "It's not that simple, Mia. I've tried. The rejection, it gets to you after a while." She placed her hand on his arm, her expression firm. "One of these days, someone's going to taste what you can do, and it's going to change everything. You just have to be ready for it." Her words were comforting, but they felt far removed from the grind of his daily life. Ethan appreciated Mia's faith in him, but he couldn't help feeling like time was slipping away. He was nearing 30, still stuck in a job that barely covered his expenses, and his dreams seemed further out of reach with every passing day. That night, as Ethan locked up the diner, he allowed himself a moment to stand outside and gaze at the city lights. The bustling streets were a reminder of the countless possibilities that lay just out of reach. Somewhere out there, he thought, people were dining in places he could only dream of stepping into. Restaurants where chefs were celebrated for their artistry, not just their ability to churn out plates. He shoved his hands into his pockets and began the walk home, the cool night air nipping at his face. As he passed by a small bakery, its window display glowing warmly, he paused to admire the carefully crafted pastries. Each one was a testament to the baker's skill and creativity, and it reignited a flicker of hope in Ethan's chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to find his place in the culinary world. But for now, all he could do was keep cooking, keep dreaming, and hope that one day, someone would take notice. Before moving forward, Do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back. It was a stormy evening when the diner's bell jingled, cutting through the rhythmic tap of rain against the windows. Ethan glanced up from the grill, expecting the usual late-night straggler. Instead, a man in a tailored suit, soaked and visibly irritated, entered. He looked wildly out of place in the greasy, worn diner, his polished shoes squelching against the linoleum floor. "Is this the only place open around here?" the man asked, his tone curt but weary. Ethan nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "Afraid so. Kitchen's still running, though." The man sighed, clearly weighing his options before dropping into the nearest booth. He didn't bother to take off his damp coat, instead drumming his fingers against the sticky tabletop. Ethan didn't press him for an order. He could already tell this was the kind of customer who wasn't in the mood for questions, so he decided to improvise. He reached for what was left of the day's produce: a few tired vegetables, a half-used block of cheese, and a small fillet of salmon he'd been saving for himself. Cooking was Ethan's language, his way of communicating without words. If this man was stuck in a diner he clearly didn't want to be in, Ethan figured he might as well surprise him. He worked quickly but carefully, letting his instincts guide him. A hint of garlic here, a sprinkle of thyme there. Despite the humble ingredients, Ethan poured everything into the dish, plating it with precision that felt almost comical in the diner's fluorescent glow. When he placed the plate in front of the man, the diner's usual chatter of clattering cutlery and murmured conversations seemed to fade. "Here you go," Ethan said simply, stepping back to observe. The man looked at the dish skeptically, his eyes flickering between Ethan and the plate. Then, without a word, he picked up his fork and took a bite. Ethan watched as the man's expression shifted. The irritation softened, replaced by something harder to define. Surprise? Curiosity? For a moment, he simply stared at the fork in his hand, then went in for another bite. The man hesitated, searching for the right word. Unexpected. Ethan smirked, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. "In a good way, I hope?" The man didn't respond immediately, too focused on the plate in front of him. Bite after bite, he dissected the dish, not with the casual indifference of someone hungry, but with the deliberate appreciation of someone who understood what they were tasting. When he finally looked up, there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Who taught you to cook like this?" Ethan shrugged, feeling both flattered and slightly defensive. "Just me, messing around in the kitchen, figuring things out." The man nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. He didn't offer his name, but his demeanor had shifted. He seemed less like a man trapped in an inconvenient situation and more like someone on the brink of a discovery. "You don't belong in a place like this," the man said suddenly, his voice firm. Ethan blinked, unsure how to respond. "Well, it's where I am," he replied, his tone even. The man leaned back, studying Ethan like a puzzle he was determined to solve. "What's your name?" "Ethan Carter." The man nodded again, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a sleek black business card. He slid it across the table, his movements deliberate. "Victor Hanley," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I'll be in touch." Ethan stared at the card, hesitant to pick it up. "Why?" Victor smirked, standing and buttoning his coat. "Because talent like yours shouldn't go unnoticed." With that, he was gone, the bell above the door ringing softly as it closed behind him. Ethan remained frozen for a moment, the business card still sitting untouched on the table. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. He'd heard the name before: Victor Hanley, the millionaire who owned half the restaurants in the city, known for his discerning palate and ruthless standards. The storm outside continued to rage, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Hope? No, it was too soon for that. Skepticism? Maybe. Whatever it was enough to make him pick up the card and slip it into his pocket. The rest of the night passed in a blur. He replayed the encounter in his mind as he cleaned the grill and wiped down tables, wondering if he'd dreamed the whole thing. By the time he locked up and stepped out into the rain, the card in his pocket felt like a strange talisman, a symbol of possibility, fragile and thrilling. Ethan didn't know what to expect, but something told him that his life had just shifted, however subtly. For better or worse, he was about to find out. A week after the encounter at the diner, Ethan was still staring at the sleek black card Victor Hanley had left behind. Every time he thought about calling the number, his stomach twisted into knots. What if this wasn't real? What if it was some kind of elaborate joke, and he was setting himself up for disappointment? But the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. Taking a deep breath, Ethan dialed the number. The voice on the other end was brisk but polite, confirming his name and explaining the details. Victor wanted Ethan to prepare a dinner for a private event at his estate, a gathering of influential figures in the culinary world. It wasn't a job offer, not yet. It was an audition. The days leading up to the event were a whirlwind of preparation. Ethan spent hours poring over recipe ideas, balancing innovation with comfort, and working within the constraints of ingredients Victor's staff had sourced. Everything had to be perfect. This wasn't just about impressing Victor. It was about proving to himself that he could rise to the occasion. When the day arrived, Ethan stepped into Victor's sprawling estate, feeling equal parts awe and intimidation. The kitchen alone was larger than the entire diner where he worked. Gleaming stainless steel counters stretched endlessly, stocked with every tool and appliance a chef could dream of. Victor was nowhere to be seen, but a staff member greeted Ethan and showed him to his station. The theme of the evening was Journeys, Victor's assistant explained, a celebration of culinary exploration and personal stories. It was as if the universe had handed Ethan the perfect canvas to showcase his talents. He decided on a menu that reflected his own journey, a starter inspired by his childhood, a main course that represented his time in culinary school, and a dessert that symbolized his aspirations. As the guests began to arrive, Ethan peeked through the kitchen doors. The dining room was filled with people who carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to luxury. Among them were food critics, Michelin-starred chefs, and restaurant owners. Their laughter and conversation filled the air, but to Ethan, it sounded like a dull roar. His focus was on the task ahead. The first course was a simple yet elegant dish, a reinterpretation of his grandmother's tomato bisque served with a twist, a basil-infused foam, and a Parmesan crisp that added a modern touch. As the waitstaff carried the bowls out to the dining room, Ethan's heart pounded. He couldn't see the reactions, but he listened intently for any sign of approval or, worse, disappointment. A ripple of murmured appreciation reached the kitchen. One guest asked the waiter, "Who made this?" Ethan exhaled, a small wave of relief washing over him. But he knew this was only the beginning. The main course was more ambitious. A pan-seared duck breast with a blackberry reduction, paired with a delicate potato rosette and seasonal vegetables. The complexity of the dish required precision, and every second felt like a race against time. Ethan's hands moved instinctively, years of practice guiding him as he plated each serving with meticulous care. When the dishes left the kitchen, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, wiping sweat from his brow. The dining room had grown quieter, the guests more focused on their meals. Victor entered the kitchen briefly, offering Ethan a nod. Not a smile, not a word of praise, just a nod. It was enough to keep him going. The final course was the one Ethan had labored over the most. A deconstructed lemon tart that balanced sweetness and tanginess, topped with a delicate sugar sculpture resembling a budding flower. It was symbolic, personal, a representation of growth and potential. As the last plates were carried out, Ethan leaned against the counter, exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through him. The dining room erupted into applause. Ethan's eyes widened, disbelief and elation mixing into a dizzying rush. One of the waitstaff returned to the kitchen, grinning. "They're asking for you." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to stepping into the spotlight, but this wasn't the time to hold back. Straightening his apron, he pushed open the kitchen doors and walked into the dining room. The applause grew louder as the guests turned to face him. Victor stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. "This," Victor said, gesturing to the table, "is what happens when talent meets opportunity." Ethan's cheeks burned as the guests began to ask him questions. Where he'd trained, how he developed his style, what inspired his menu. He answered as best he could, the words tumbling out in a mixture of nervousness and excitement. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just as a cook, but as an artist. By the end of the night, as the guests began to leave, Victor approached Ethan with a glass of champagne. "You exceeded my expectations," he said simply. "We'll talk soon." Ethan didn't know what soon meant, but as he walked out of the estate under the night sky, clutching the most genuine praise he'd ever received, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a good night. This was the beginning of something bigger. The days following the event at Victor Hanley's estate felt surreal to Ethan. Every detail of the evening replayed in his mind. The applause, the questions from the guests, Victor's approving nod. It was a high he wasn't used to, and while he didn't want to get ahead of himself, he couldn't help but feel that something big was about to happen. He had given his best, poured his soul into that meal, and for the first time in years, it seemed to have paid off. When his phone finally rang, Ethan almost didn't answer it. The number was unfamiliar, and for a fleeting moment, he thought it might be a telemarketer. But something told him to pick up, and as soon as he heard Victor's voice, his stomach did a nervous flip. "Ethan," Victor said in his steady, businesslike tone, "I've been thinking about what you did the other night. We should discuss the future. Can you come to my office tomorrow at noon?" The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but its implications sent Ethan pacing his small apartment for hours. What did Victor mean by discuss the future? Was he offering a job? A partnership? The possibilities seemed endless, and by the time Ethan finally fell asleep, his nerves were frayed from excitement and anticipation. The next day, Ethan found himself sitting in the sleek, glass-walled office of Victor Hanley. Everything about the space screamed success, from the minimalist decor to the panoramic view of the city skyline. Victor sat across from him, his hands steepled as he spoke. "You've got something special," Victor began, his tone measured. "It's rare to find someone who can create food that tells a story. I don't say this lightly. I believe you have what it takes to make a mark in this industry." Ethan tried to keep his face neutral, but he could feel his chest tightening with excitement. This wasn't just praise. It was validation from someone who mattered, someone with the power to change his life. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I'm proposing. We open a restaurant together. I'll handle the financial side, the branding, the location. You focus on the food, the menu, the kitchen, the staff. It'll all be yours. But," he added, raising a finger, "there are conditions. This will be a high-end establishment, catering to an elite clientele. That means some creative concessions will have to be made." The words hit Ethan like a splash of cold water. Creative concessions? He wanted to ask what that meant, but he already had an idea. Fancy dishes tailored to wealthy diners with predictable tastes. No risks, no experimentation. The thought made his stomach churn, but he couldn't deny the opportunity staring him in the face. This was his chance to break free from the diner, to finally be recognized. Wasn't that what he had always wanted? Victor seemed to sense his hesitation. "Look," he said, his tone softening slightly, "I know it's not ideal, but this is how the game works. You make your name by succeeding in their world. Once you've established yourself, you'll have the freedom to do things your way. Trust me, it's worth it." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He hated the idea of compromise, but Victor wasn't wrong. He couldn't change the industry overnight. Maybe this was the stepping stone he needed. With a deep breath, he extended his hand. "I'm in." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Victor's team worked quickly, securing a prime location in the heart of the city and transforming it into a sleek, modern space. Ethan was involved in every decision that mattered to him. The layout of the kitchen, the hiring of staff, the creation of the menu. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle reminders of the compromises he'd agreed to make. Dishes that were too bold were toned down. Ingredients that felt too niche were swapped for safer alternatives. Every time he pushed for something unique, Victor would remind him, "We're building a reputation here. Play the long game." Despite the constraints, Ethan poured himself into the work. The menu, while not as daring as he'd envisioned, still reflected his style and skill. On opening night, as the first guest trickled in, he stood in the kitchen, his nerves coiled like a spring. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. The evening was a resounding success. The dining room buzzed with energy, and guests left glowing reviews about the food and the atmosphere. By the end of the night, Ethan was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, even if it wasn't exactly how he'd imagined. Yet, as the praise rolled in and the reservations began to fill the books, there was a nagging feeling Ethan couldn't shake. Every so often, when a dish was sent back to the kitchen for being too adventurous, or when Victor gently reminded him to stay within the lines, a small part of him wondered if he was losing himself in the process. He dismissed the thoughts as growing pains. After all, wasn't this how success worked? You made sacrifices, built your name, and then, one day, you got to call the shots. But late at night, as he stared at the ceiling in his apartment, he couldn't help but wonder, how long could he keep playing by someone else's rules? Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the grand opening night arrived with all the pomp and energy Ethan had imagined, and more. The restaurant glowed like a jewel in the city's bustling heart, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the lights of passing cars and the hum of a crowd eager to experience something new. Inside, the space was alive with anticipation. The muted elegance of the decor, a blend of modern minimalism and warm, inviting tones, was matched only by the tantalizing scents wafting from the kitchen. Ethan stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, trying to steady his nerves. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filtered in from the dining room, where the city's elite had gathered. Socialites, food critics, and influencers mingled, their expectations as high as the restaurant's reputation promised. Victor, ever the polished host, moved among the guests, his charisma a perfect complement to the evening's grandeur. Chef Carter, one of the servers, called, snapping Ethan out of his thoughts. "The appetizers are ready for the first round." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. This was his moment. Months of preparation, long nights, and countless revisions to the menu had led to this. He began issuing commands, his voice steady and clear despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. His team, handpicked and trained over the last few weeks, moved with precision, each person knowing their role in executing his vision. The first course was an elegant trio of small bites: a smoked salmon canopy with dill creme fraiche, a beet tartlet with whipped goat cheese, and a miniature croquette with a surprising burst of truffle. The plates left the kitchen one by one, carried by servers who moved with the grace of dancers. Ethan watched them disappear through the swinging doors, his heart pounding in anticipation. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for some sign of the guests' reactions. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, the low hum of approval. A few scattered exclamations reached his ears. Exquisite, unexpected, absolutely divine. The knot in his stomach loosened slightly. The night had begun on a high note. As the courses progressed, Ethan found himself immersed in the rhythm of the kitchen. The main dishes, a delicate balance of artistry and flavor, showcased his technical skill and creativity. A seared halibut with saffron beurre blanc, a tender fillet with a black garlic juice, and a vegetarian option of charred cauliflower with pomegranate molasses. Each dish was crafted to leave a lasting impression. But as the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake a lingering unease. While the guests' praise was gratifying, he noticed that some of his favorite touches, subtle flavors, or unconventional pairings, were going unnoticed. One guest even commented to Victor, "This is wonderfully safe for a new place," a remark that reached Ethan through the server grapevine and stuck like a thorn in his side. Safe. He had never wanted his food to be described that way. Victor breezed into the kitchen midway through the evening, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "They love it," he said, his grin wide and confident. "The critics are eating it up, literally and figuratively." "You've done it, Ethan." Ethan forced a smile, nodding. "Thanks, Victor. It's been a team effort." Victor didn't seem to notice the hint of reservation in Ethan's voice. He was already out the door, back to working the room. Ethan returned to the kitchen, where the final course, a dessert trio of chocolate souffle, Meyer lemon panna cotta, and a raspberry millefeuille, was being plated with painstaking care. The desserts went out, and the night began to wind down. Ethan leaned against the counter, exhaustion settling in. His team was beaming, celebrating quietly as the last few plates were cleared. By all accounts, The evening had been a resounding success. Reservations were already piling up for the weeks ahead, and the critics were likely to write glowing reviews. Yet, as Ethan looked out at the dining room, now empty except for Victor and a handful of guests lingering over drinks, he felt an odd hollowness. Victor walked back into the kitchen, this time with a glass of champagne in hand. To the man of the hour, he said, raising his glass toward Ethan, "You've made quite an impression tonight." "Thanks," Ethan replied, managing a small smile. "It's surreal, honestly." Victor chuckled. "Get used to it. This is just the beginning. You've got talent, Ethan. All you need to do now is keep delivering." As Victor left, Ethan's sous chef, a young woman named Kara, approached him. "You should be proud, chef," she said. "We pulled off something incredible tonight." Ethan nodded, appreciating her words. "We did," he said. "The whole team did." Still, as he walked through the quiet restaurant after everyone had gone, wiping down counters and checking the kitchen one last time, Ethan couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of his mind. The voice that whispered about compromises, about how much of himself he'd had to hold back. The voice that wondered if this was the dream he'd worked so hard for, or just the closest he could get for now. He turned off the lights and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city hummed around him, vibrant and alive. As he stood there, staring at the glowing sign of his restaurant, he allowed himself a moment of pride. But he also made a silent promise. Tonight was just the start. The dream wasn't complete. Not yet. The days following the grand opening were a whirlwind of activity. Reservations flooded in, critics wrote glowing reviews, and word of mouth spread like wildfire. Ethan's restaurant quickly became the city's hottest dining destination, a status symbol for those who could snag a table. Every evening, the dining room was packed with patrons dressed to impress, their laughter and chatter filling the space. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, but beneath the glossy veneer of success, Ethan felt a growing unease. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion. Running a restaurant at this level was grueling, and the pressure to maintain perfection was constant. But as the weeks went on, Ethan began to notice things that gnawed at him. A dish he'd been proud of, a playful twist on a classic pasta, was quietly pulled from the menu after a guest deemed it too unfamiliar. An innovative dessert idea was vetoed by Victor, who claimed it would be too risky for their clientele. Every decision seemed to edge closer to safety, to predictability, to pleasing the same wealthy crowd over and over. Ethan tried to shake off the frustration. This was the price of success, wasn't it? Compromises had to be made. Yet every time he stood in the kitchen, watching his carefully crafted dishes leave the pass, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was missing. He'd envisioned his food as a way to tell stories, to evoke emotion, to take people on a journey. But now, he felt like he was cooking for approval, not passion. The tipping point came one evening when a food critic, a regular at the restaurant, requested a meeting with Ethan after dinner. The critic, an older man with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue, praised the execution of the meal, but followed it with a remark that hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "It's all very polished, very refined," the critic said, swirling the last sip of wine in his glass. "But it lacks soul. Your food is flawless, but it feels safe, like it's trying too hard to impress." Ethan managed a polite nod, but inside, he was reeling. As the critic walked away, his words echoed in Ethan's mind. Safe. Trying too hard to impress. That wasn't who Ethan was, or at least it wasn't who he wanted to be. He'd spent years dreaming of this moment, of being recognized and respected, but now that he was here, it felt hollow. Success built on compromises didn't feel like success at all. Later that night, Ethan confronted Victor in the restaurant's office. The two men stood on opposite sides of the desk, the tension between them palpable. "We need to make some changes," Ethan began, his voice steady but firm. "The food is not what I wanted it to be. I feel like I'm losing my voice in the kitchen." Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Ethan, you're overthinking this. The restaurant is thriving. The reviews are great. The customers are happy. What more could you want?" "I want authenticity," Ethan replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I want to create dishes that mean something, not just cater to what we think people want." Victor sighed, rubbing his temples. You have to understand, this is how the game works. You build your reputation first. Once you're established, then you can take risks. But right now, we can't afford to alienate the clientele. Ethan shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. At what cost, Victor? How long do I have to play this game before I can actually cook the way I want? Victor's gaze hardened. This isn't just about you, Ethan. There's a lot riding on this restaurant. Money, reputation, expectations. You can't let your ego get in the way. Ego. Ethan's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. This isn't about ego. This is about integrity. About staying true to why I started cooking in the first place. The argument escalated, voices sharp and cutting, until Victor finally stood and pointed toward the door. If you're not willing to compromise, maybe you're not ready for this level of success. Ethan stared at him, chest heaving, before turning and leaving the office. His mind raced as he walked through the empty restaurant, the once glowing space now feeling cold and unfamiliar. The words Victor had thrown at him lingered, heavy and bitter. Maybe you're not ready. That night, Ethan lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. Victor's words had stung, but the critics had cut deeper. They were a reminder of the promises Ethan had made to himself, promises he'd started to break. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He was at a crossroads. He could keep chasing success on Victor's terms, or he could find a way back to the passion that had led him here in the first place. By the time the sun rose, Ethan had made a decision. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to lose himself in the process. If success meant compromising his identity, then it wasn't the kind of success he wanted. Something had to change, and it had to start with him. Ethan sat in the middle seat of the cramped bus, the rhythmic hum of the tires lulling him into a rare moment of stillness. Outside the window, the city skyline gave way to rolling hills and open fields, a stark contrast to the polished, high-pressure world he had left behind. He told Victor he needed time to reflect, to recalibrate. Victor hadn't been pleased, but Ethan knew this wasn't negotiable. If he stayed in the restaurant another week, he feared he'd lose the last shred of passion that had fueled his journey. The bus came to a stop in a small coastal town, where the air smelled of salt and the distant cry of seagulls punctuated the quiet. Ethan stepped off with nothing but a duffel bag and a notebook filled with sketches of dishes he'd been too afraid to pitch. This wasn't just a break. It was a chance to find himself again. The town was quaint, its main street lined with weathered buildings and cozy cafes. Ethan had rented a small room above one of those cafes, owned by a woman named Claire. She greeted him warmly, her eyes kind but perceptive, as if she could see the weariness he carried. "Looking for peace? Are you?" she asked as she handed him the keys. "Something like that," Ethan replied, his voice softer than usual. The first few days were disorienting. He was used to the constant buzz of the kitchen, the sharp focus of managing a team, the adrenaline of service. Here, the hours stretched out like open roads, leaving him alone with his thoughts. It wasn't until he wandered down to the docks one morning that he began to feel the stirrings of inspiration. The fishermen were unloading their catch, their movements unhurried yet precise. Ethan watched as they worked, marveling at the simplicity of it all. The fish were fresh, their scales gleaming in the sunlight. One of the fishermen, a wiry man named Tom, noticed Ethan's interest and struck up a conversation. "You a chef or something?" Tom asked, handing Ethan a plump sea bass. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, something like that." Tom grinned. "Well, if you want the best, you've come to the right place. Nothing like cooking something that was swimming a few hours ago." Ethan thanked him and carried the fish back to his tiny kitchen above the cafe. He had no plan, no elaborate concept. He simply wanted to cook. With a handful of herbs he'd picked up at the local market and a lemon he'd borrowed from Claire's pantry, he prepared the sea bass, letting its natural flavor shine. As he sat by the window and tasted the first bite, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: joy. That evening, Claire invited Ethan to join her for dinner at a small gathering of locals. He brought along the sea bass, hesitant but curious to see their reactions. The group was a mix of farmers, artists, and small business owners. Their laughter and easy camaraderie a refreshing change from the guarded conversations of his usual clientele. When they tasted the dish, their praise wasn't laced with politeness or pretense. It was genuine, heartfelt. "This is amazing," one of them said, her eyes wide. "You can taste the ocean in it." Ethan smiled, a warmth spreading through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his food had connected with people in the way he'd always intended. It wasn't about impressing anyone or meeting expectations. It was about creating something that brought people together. Over the next few weeks, Ethan immersed himself in the rhythms of the town. He spent mornings at the docks, afternoons at the local farmer's market, and evenings experimenting in his little kitchen. The simplicity of the ingredients and the stories behind them reignited his creativity. He began jotting down ideas for dishes inspired by the town's landscapes and its people. Dishes that celebrated freshness, authenticity, and connection. One day, while helping Tom prepare nets for the next day's catch, Ethan had an epiphany. Cooking wasn't just about the food, it was about the journey behind it. The care of the fisherman, the dedication of the farmer, the joy of sharing a meal. All of it was part of the story. And somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. In the evenings, Claire would often join Ethan in the cafe's kitchen, sharing stories of her late husband, who had once dreamed of being a chef. He used to say that food was like love, she told Ethan one night. Simple, honest, and best when shared. Ethan took those words to heart. He realized he didn't need a fancy dining room or a high-profile clientele to make an impact. What mattered was staying true to his vision, even if it meant taking risks and walking away from comfort. As his time in the town drew to a close, Ethan felt lighter, more grounded. He had rediscovered the joy of cooking, not for accolades or approval, but for the simple act of creating something meaningful. On his last night, he hosted a small dinner for the friends he'd made, serving dishes inspired by the town's people and their stories. The meal wasn't perfect, but it was full of heart, and that was enough. When Ethan boarded the bus back to the city, he carried more than just his duffel bag. He carried a renewed sense of purpose, a clear vision of what he wanted to create. The journey had reminded him of who he was and why he had started cooking in the first place. It wasn't about chasing success. It was about sharing a piece of himself with every plate he served. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Ethan walked into the restaurant's office with a calm determination he hadn't felt in months. Victor was seated at his desk, poring over a spreadsheet on his laptop. The faint hum of the bustling dining room echoed through the walls, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was laser-focused on the conversation he was about to have. Victor looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Ethan, back from your sabbatical, I see. I hope you're ready to jump back in. The team's been holding down the fort, but they've missed their captain." Ethan leaned against the edge of the desk, meeting Victor's gaze with unwavering eyes. "I didn't come back to continue as things were." Victor's hands paused over the keyboard. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I've had time to think, to step back and look at what we're doing here. The restaurant is successful. There's no denying that. But it's not what I envisioned, Victor. It's not what I want my career to stand for." Victor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You've been out of the game for weeks, and now you're coming back to tell me you're unhappy with our success?" "Ethan, we're at the top of our field. People would kill for what we've built. I'm not saying the success isn't important," Ethan replied. "But at what cost? I've compromised too much, my vision, my creativity, my passion. I realized that while I was away, I rediscovered why I started cooking in the first place. And it wasn't to cater to a select group of wealthy diners who don't want to be challenged." Victor frowned, the tension in the room palpable. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" Ethan stepped away from the desk and began pacing, his mind racing as he put his thoughts into words. "I want to reimagine the restaurant. I want to focus on authenticity, on creating food that tells a story, real, meaningful dishes that connect with people on a deeper level. I want to move away from the exclusivity and make this place accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford a reservation months in advance." Victor stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You want to make a fine dining restaurant? Inclusive?" "Yes," Ethan said firmly. We can still maintain quality and innovation, but we don't have to cater to the same tired expectations. We can redefine what a high-end dining experience means. Victor sighed, rubbing his temples. Ethan, I appreciate your passion, but this sounds risky. We've established ourselves in a very specific market. Changing that could alienate our clientele. Do you have any idea how much we've invested in this image? Ethan stopped pacing and faced Victor directly. I do, but I also know that the restaurant is nothing without its heart, and right now, it's missing that. People can sense when something is purely for show, and sooner or later, they'll move on to the next trendy spot. But if we create something genuine, something that resonates, it'll last. I'm willing to take that risk because I believe in it. Victor leaned back again, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan. You're asking me to gamble everything we've built. I'm asking you to trust me, Ethan said quietly. Just like you did when you invited me to cook for that first event. You saw potential in me, and I delivered. Let me do it again, on my terms. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Victor tapped his fingers against the desk, his gaze distant as he weighed the proposal. Finally, he exhaled, the lines of resistance on his face softening slightly. All right, he said, his voice measured. I'll give you a chance, but we need a plan, something concrete. I'll give you 3 months to test this idea. If it works, we'll move forward. If it doesn't, we go back to business as usual. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. 3 months. I'll make it work. Victor held up a hand, his expression stern. Understand this, Ethan. If you fail, the restaurant's reputation takes the hit. You're playing with more than just your career here. You're playing with mine. Ethan met his gaze steadily. I know, and I won't let you down. As Ethan left the office, he felt a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. He had just thrown down a gauntlet, not only for Victor, but for himself. He was taking a leap into the unknown, risking everything he'd worked for to create something he truly believed in. The thought was terrifying, but also thrilling. That night, as he sat in the empty kitchen, sketching out ideas for the new direction, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. This was his chance to reclaim his identity as a chef, to create something that mattered. He wasn't just chasing success anymore. He was chasing meaning. The next 3 months would be the hardest of his career, but for the first time, he felt ready. Whatever came next, he knew he was on the right path, and that, he thought, was worth every risk. Ethan stood in the center of the kitchen, the familiar hum of activity surrounding him, yet everything felt different. This wasn't the high-pressure environment of maintaining the status quo. This was the electric energy of transformation. The restaurant had officially begun its 3-month experiment, and every inch of it was infused with the excitement of something new. Ethan had spent weeks poring over the details, redesigning the menu, reimagining the space, and training his team to approach the dining experience with fresh eyes. The new concept was bold but simple. Food that told a story, rooted in authenticity and connection. The menu was stripped of the pretension that had marked the restaurant's early days. Gone were the overly elaborate dishes designed to impress at first glance. Instead, the offerings now reflected a balance of innovation and comfort. A delicate scallop crudo inspired by the coastal town Ethan had visited, a hearty lamb stew reimagined with unexpected spices, a rustic sourdough bread served with butter infused with local herbs. Ethan worked side by side with his team, instilling in them the importance of each ingredient, each plate, and each interaction with the guests. For the first time, he encouraged them to share their own ideas, weaving their diverse perspectives into the fabric of the menu. The result was a restaurant that felt alive, personal, and deeply human. The first night of the relaunch was nerve-wracking. Ethan knew the stakes were high, not just for him, but for Victor, the staff, and the reputation they had built. As the first guests began to arrive, he found himself hovering by the kitchen door, peeking out at the dining room. The space had been subtly transformed, its sleek, modern lines softened with warm lighting and intimate touches. The atmosphere felt welcoming, not intimidating, and Ethan hoped it would set the tone for the experience to come. The evening started quietly, with diners tentatively exploring the new menu. Ethan's team worked with precision and care, each plate leaving the kitchen a testament to their hard work and shared vision. At first, there was little feedback, just the clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation. But as the courses progressed, something magical began to happen. One table called their server over to compliment the chef on the richness of the lamb stew. Another guest, a middle-aged woman dining alone, stopped to speak to Ethan personally after tasting the sourdough. "This bread," she said, her eyes shining, "tastes just like the one my grandmother used to make. Thank you for that." Ethan's chest tightened, the words hitting him with unexpected force. This was why he had fought so hard to make these changes. Not for accolades or headlines, but for moments like this. Moments where food became a bridge to something deeper, something meaningful. By the time dessert was served, a deceptively simple pear tart that had taken weeks to perfect, the dining room was abuzz. Guests were sharing bites of their dishes, leaning across tables to exchange stories about flavors that reminded them of childhood, travels, or loved ones. The atmosphere was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced in his restaurant before. It wasn't just a meal, it was a shared experience, a tapestry of connections unfolding in real time. Victor arrived late in the evening, slipping into the dining room unnoticed. Ethan caught sight of him through the kitchen window, watching as he moved among the tables. For a moment, Ethan tensed, unsure of how Victor would react to the changes. But then he saw it. The slight smile on Victor's face, the way he lingered to listen as guests spoke animatedly about their meals. It was subtle, but it was their approval. After the last guests had left, the staff gathered in the kitchen, their faces flushed with the thrill of a successful night. Ethan stood at the center, exhausted but elated, as the team erupted into cheers and applause. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. Victor joined them shortly after, his usual composed demeanor softened by what seemed like genuine admiration. "Ethan," he said, raising a glass of wine, "you've pulled off something remarkable here. I didn't think it was possible, but you proved me wrong. This is special." Ethan smiled, the validation meaningful but no longer necessary. He wasn't doing this for Victor or for the critics. He was doing it for the joy of creating something real. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant's transformation continued to gain momentum. Word spread quickly, drawing in a new wave of guests. People from all walks of life who came not just for the food, but for the experience. The critics returned, their reviews glowing with praise for the restaurant's bold new direction. "A triumph of authenticity," one article declared. "Chef Ethan Carter has redefined fine dining, proving that heart and innovation can coexist." Ethan felt a quiet pride as he read the reviews, but it was the small, everyday moments that stayed with him. Watching a young couple toast to their anniversary over a plate of handmade pasta, hearing a group of friends laugh as they shared stories over dessert, seeing his staff beam with pride as they presented dishes that reflected their own creativity. By the end of the 3 months, the results were undeniable. The restaurant wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Ethan had stayed true to his vision, and in doing so, he had created something that resonated far beyond his expectations. For the first time, he felt at peace, not because of the success, but because he had found a way to balance his passion with his principles. Victor approached Ethan one evening after the last table had cleared. "You've got your restaurant," he said simply, "and it's everything you promised it would be." Ethan nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We've got our restaurant," he corrected, glancing at his team bustling in the background. It wasn't just his dream anymore, it was theirs too. And that, he thought, was the greatest triumph of all. Years had passed since the restaurant's transformation, yet its warmth and energy remained the same. Ethan Carter stood in the open kitchen, a far cry from the days of the cramped diner or the slick, impersonal dining space the restaurant had once been. The space was alive with the sounds of clinking glasses, soft laughter, and the quiet hum of contented diners. Above it all, there was a sense of belonging that Ethan had worked so hard to create. The restaurant had become more than a business. It was a community hub, a place where people came to celebrate milestones, share stories, or simply enjoy a meal that felt like home. Ethan's philosophy, rooted in authenticity and connection, had blossomed into a guiding principle, one that resonated with his team and his guests. The menu evolved with the seasons, inspired by the local farmers, fishermen, and artisans Ethan had cultivated relationships with over the years. Every dish told a story, not just of Ethan's journey, but of the people who contributed to its creation. Tonight, Ethan wasn't just overseeing service. He was mentoring a young chef named Mateo, a recent addition to the team. Mateo was bright-eyed and eager, his passion reminding Ethan of his own younger self. He had approached Ethan months ago with a notebook full of ideas and a dream of making his mark on the culinary world. "Chef," Mateo said nervously, presenting a dish he had been working on. I wanted to see if this could go on the specials board next week." Ethan smiled, taking the plate and inspecting it carefully. The presentation was thoughtful, the flavors vibrant. He tasted it, nodding in approval. "This is good, Mateo. Really good. But tell me why this dish? What's the story behind it?" Mateo hesitated, then smiled shyly. "It's my mom's recipe. She used to make it for me when I was little, but I added a few twists to make it my own." Ethan grinned. "Perfect. That's exactly the kind of food we celebrate here. Food with heart. Let's refine it together and make it shine." The exchange filled Ethan with a sense of pride. Passing on his knowledge and helping young chefs find their voice had become one of the most rewarding parts of his career. It was a reminder of how far he had come, not just as a chef, but as a leader and mentor. Later that evening, as service wound down and the last guests lingered over coffee and dessert, Ethan stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The city buzzed around him, vibrant and alive, but he felt at peace. The restaurant's sign glowed softly above him, its name no longer just a symbol of success, but a testament to everything he had built with his team. Victor Hanley joined him outside, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Ethan with a small smile. "You know," Victor said, leaning against the wall, "when you first pitched that whole authenticity idea to me, I thought you were crazy." Ethan laughed, taking a sip of his drink. "You didn't exactly hide it." Victor chuckled. "Fair enough, but you proved me wrong. This place, it's something special. I've worked with a lot of chefs in my time, but none of them have done what you've done here." Ethan glanced at him, his expression warm. "That means a lot, Victor. And for what it's worth, I couldn't have done it without your support, even when we didn't see eye to eye." They clinked glasses, the moment carrying the weight of their shared journey. Victor had been a mentor, a partner, and at times a rival, but in the end, they had built something extraordinary together. As they stood there, a couple exited the restaurant, pausing to thank Ethan for the meal. "It was incredible," the woman said. "Your food, it's like it tells a story." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "That's exactly what we aim for. Thank you for sharing the evening with us." After Victor left, Ethan returned to the kitchen to help his team finish cleaning up. He moved through the space with ease, checking in with each of his staff, offering encouragement and gratitude. When the last pan was scrubbed and the lights were dimmed, Ethan stood in the empty dining room, taking it all in. His mind wandered back to where it all began: the cramped diner, the rejection letters, the stormy night when Victor walked through the door. He thought about the risks he'd taken, the sacrifices, and the moments of doubt. Every step of the journey had been worth it, not because of the accolades or the success, but because it had led him here, to this place, surrounded by people who shared his vision and believed in the power of food to bring people together. As he locked up for the night, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The restaurant wasn't just a reflection of his dream. It was a living, breathing testament to the importance of staying true to oneself. He had found a way to balance passion with purpose, to create something that mattered, not just to him, but to everyone who walked through its doors. Ethan smiled to himself as he stepped into the cool night air. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But he was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was chasing anything. He was living it. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.